So having discussed the copy principle and kind of how that sets the parameters for what Hume will consider, proper to the scope of what philosophers ought to be making claims about, he then proceeds to more sort of positive aspects of his empiricism. So in continuing to look at the notes here, on page 2 of the notes, Hume is going to talk about something similar that Locke talked about. He talks about the ways that we associate our ideas together. Once we have an impression that gives rise to an idea, what are the ways in which we associate those ideas? And remember, Locke had said something similar about the way that our ideas agree or disagree was Locke's way of discussing kind of the same thing that Hume is discussing here, but he's talking about the way we associate our ideas with each other. And so there are three ways in which that can happen: resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. Now, Hume's primary interest is with cause and effect because he thinks that so much of our reasoning about the world takes the form of cause and effect reasoning. The way that we associate one idea with another, we come to call one of those ideas an effect, and we recognize that anytime we think of one of these ideas, another idea seems to show up with it. And we call that other idea the cause of the other idea that we're thinking about. And we give the names cause and effect to these ideas. And so cause and effect reasoning then is further considered as it falls within a larger schema of the types of reasoning that we engage in. So the other three were the ways that we associate our ideas, and now Hume wants to talk about how there are two ways that human beings engage in reasoning, and this distinction between the way that we relate, we either our reasoning either is about the relations between ideas, or it's reasoning about matters of fact. And you'll quickly realize that this distinction is related to Leibniz's distinction between truths of fact and truths of reason. This distinction will come up in other contexts too. In Kant, it'll be the distinction between analytic and synthetic. This distinction, it comes up throughout modern philosophy, but Hume is talking in particular about, he has his own terminology for it. We either reason about the relations between ideas or we reason about matters of fact. Now, reasoning about the relations between ideas, this is a kind of a priori reasoning. That we don't need to consult experience to determine the truth or falsity of the relations between our ideas. And so he considers certain kinds of science and certain kind of mathematical reasoning as relations of ideas. And the key thing for a relation of idea is that the opposite, if we assert the opposite of a relation between ideas, it would lead to a contradiction. So the relations between ideas follow the law of non-contradiction in determining their truth or falsity. Whereas matters of fact are more what Hume is concerned with, and this will be concern the relation between cause and effect. The relation, the association of our ideas of cause and effect is what will be considered here. So the association of ideas, cause and effect, falls within the kind of reasoning that Hume calls matters of fact. And so what does he say? In contrast to truths that arise from relations of ideas, matters of fact can always in our imagination be contradicted. Contrary to every matter of fact is always possible. So for example, if we say that the sun will not rise tomorrow, that is not a contradiction. It is possible. That doesn't mean it's likely, but it is not. There's no contradiction in asserting that the sun won't rise tomorrow. So he wants to say, what evidence do we have that tells us that matters of fact are true, considering that, especially as it relates to cause and effect. especially as it relates to cause and effect, because so much of what we claim to know about the world is based upon matters of fact, um, and the relation between causes and their effects. He wants to say, well, what evidence do we have that tells us that these things are actually true, or that we know them? So it's an epistemic inquiry here, because Hume's sort of eventually going to say we don't in fact have any basis to claim that we know anything about causes and effects. We have expectations about what the future will be like based upon the past, but does an expectation about the future amount to any kind of knowledge? Well, Hume is going to say no. So we don't, in fact, know. But so he wants to. That's kind of ruining the ending, so to speak. But I want to. Before we get there, let's look at what Hume says, right? So at the top of page 3, he says, if we are to satisfy ourselves concerning the nature of the evidence by which we assume matters of fact, we must inquire how we arrive at the knowledge of cause and effects, regarding not just objects, but also events. So let me just pause for a moment. So regarding cause and effect, Hume wants to talk about two different ways that so there are objects that we come into contact with. So maybe we come into contact with a new object that we've never seen before. And if he thinks if we actually reflect on experience, we will not know anything about that new thing that we've come into contact with. If we've never seen it before, we will have no basis to know what that thing is. So he says, we must admit when we look at our experience, when we come into contact with new objects, we were not automatically able to know what caused it or what it may cause. So there's nothing about the object itself that will tell us anything about it, and we will have no past experience to draw on there. Similarly, for events, and this is one of Hume's most famous examples, we may think that when we see an event, for example, one billiard ball comes into contact with another billiard ball, and it causes that billiard ball to move forward. Hume would say there's nothing in that event itself that reveals anything to us about causes and effects. So he says, so I'm reading here, we think we can infer simply from witnessing one billiard ball hitting another what would happen, but we can't infer it a priori. The only reason we think we would know what would happen is that we have witnessed the result before, and that conclusion has been supported by repeated observations. So what Hume is saying here is, again, going back to matters of fact, there's no contradiction in thinking, for example, that if the billiard ball hit another billiard ball, that they would just stop and that nothing would happen. There's nothing contradictory about assuming that. So again, as long as we can imagine that the opposite or the contrary is possible, there's nothing to say that somehow cause and effect is an a priori relation that holds between two ideas. So again, every cause must have an effect is not a reasoning based on relations of ideas, that somehow the cause, like similar to all bachelors or unmarried men, the concept of causation does not contain an effect. It doesn't contain within it any principles that similar to reasoning about like mathematics or all bachelors or unmarried men. So the cause does not contain the predicate effect. It's only experience and past experience that allows us to expect that causes and effects will continue into the future. But it is not an a priori reasoning that we can use to determine the relationship between causes and effect. So again, if we were to see one billiard ball hitting another for the first time, there's no reason why we would not think that the second billiard ball would say not move or fly straight up. So again, that's Hume's evidence that upon experiencing an event for the first time, right, we have no a priori reason to know what will happen. So that on its own, the experience of an event for the very first time, is evidence for Hume that it is not a relation between two ideas. Cause and effect is not a relationship between two ideas, right? So, in a word, quote, every effect is a distinct event from its cause. It could not, therefore, be discovered in the cause, and the first invention or conception of it a priori must be entirely arbitrary. So again, the big takeaway here is cause and effect for Hume is not a relation between ideas. Cause and effect is reasoning based on matters of fact. Um, and to imagine the contrary or the opposite is not impossible. And I have a hard time understanding how we might refute him here, because if we can imagine the contrary, then it means that cause and effect for Hume again don't rise to the level of knowledge, and that's a pretty startling claim. This is the thing about Hume, is that Hume's skepticism, similar to Berkeley's, gives rise to some very uncomfortable truths about the way that we kind of comport ourselves to our daily experience. And the question is, what do we do with these claims that Hume's gives us? Does it fundamentally alter the way we think about our experience in the world, or is this kind of just a philosophical truth that doesn't really have any direct bearing on our kind of daily experience? And that's a question I kind of want you to think about. So I'm going to take another just pause here, and I'll be right back.